ever thought about how they make all the spacesuits and cloth items for spaceflight and how they might fix them?
Do you mean like the things that are sewn?
Yeah, if you think about it, you can't just run around to the spacesuit store, go to the spacesuit store on the corner,
Yeah.
and, buy or fix your damaged equipment. I think that the astronauts should know how to sew. Do you remember when I bought that Sailrite sewing machine, like that super heavy duty sewing machine at the thrift store?
Yeah.
It didn't dawn on me why you would really want a sewing machine that big and on a boat until you think about how truly large the oceans are and how much problems you could run into. But when you think about it, space is larger than that and even more unforgiving than that.
Yeah, it is. So, what kind of things do you think they'll need to sew?
I think they'd need to be able to, repair their spacesuits, like in case of a tear or puncture. You're working on the moon, and you puncture your suit with a sharp rock. You got to be able to fix that. They also need to be able to make modifications to their suit. You ate a little bit too much at lunch, and your belt ain't fitting how it used to. You're going to need to be able to want to fix that.
Well, I don't know if the astronaut's going to have that problem, but it sure makes sense. I never thought of how important sewing would be for space. We should load up in the rocket van and see what we can learn.
You know what? I think you're right. Let's go. Jack and Chad in a van. Jack and Chad's rocket van.
So the reason why Jack and I really wanted to look into sewing into space is as we were walking through Kennedy Space Center, we noticed a couple things. One was an astronaut sewing kit, and the other was some Boy Scout stuff. And I'll let Jack tell you a little bit, since he's an Eagle Scout, I'll let him tell you a little bit about sewing in the Scouts.
So, sewing in the Scouts, in Scouts BSA, it's not necessarily a taught merit badge, because it is not. It's not a taught skill, but it's something that each Scout learns how to do either through their mothers, sisters, or themselves, and, they gotta sew their patches onto, their uniform, their merit badge sash. So, they gotta know how to do that, and that's why the astronauts typically knew how to sew, is because a large amount of them were Scouts. Several of them were Eagle Scouts, like Jim Lovell and Neil Armstrong.
Yeah, Neil Armstrong was
several of those.
Yeah.
And
so when the Eagle has landed, do you think they were talking about the ship or Neil Armstrong, since he was an Eagle Scout? Yeah,
mysteries of time.
Yeah, I was definitely amazed at how many astronauts were Scouts, and that sewing was something we talked about with other parents in the Scouts. Is that it really should be a merit badge because it's such an important skill. If you're on a hike in the middle of nowhere and you need to repair your bag, it's a good skill. It's sewn on badges and stuff like that. So let's switch that and let's talk about the space program. So in the space program, well, what happens, Jack, if you have a damaged space suit and you're on the moon?
Well, what you gotta do is you gotta fix that hole. Because you don't want a vacuum in your suit.
You don't. Nobody wants a vacuum in their suit. That is absolutely right. So one of the things that goes on is people spend a lot of time, one, making sure the suits don't get damaged, right? A lot of engineering goes into that. But when they're sewing them, I know my sewing skills are not the greatest on earth. I can do it. I usually call it bush sewing. I would not call it a fine sewing skill. But what happens on a blanket, like on Earth, if you put a hole in the wrong spot?
Well, you don't have problems sleeping.
Yeah. What happens if you do that when you're making a spacesuit?
Well, when you have a hole in your spacesuit, it's no longer a spacesuit. It's just a piece of cloth that's wrapped around you in a vacuum.
Yeah, because really a spacesuit is just another spacecraft, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because
spacecraft.
You have to have all of your air, your water, everything, your temperature control, all has to be inside of there. So in the Apollo program, a lot of the things as they were making the spacesuits in Gemini and Mercury, they had to sew all these things together. So bringing seamstresses in to sew those have been very important. Jack and I saw we saw moon suits at Smithsonian, right? One of the ones that actually went to the moon. And while they look really high tech and stuff like that, there are a bunch of stitches with material. What did you think about that sewing kit when we saw it? Could you imagine an astronaut actually using that?
For some reason, no. When you see spacesuits, you don't necessarily think of a very simple fix because you're thinking about how airtight it needs to be. And I don't think that that could be easily achieved with a small little sewing kit. But I think if you tried enough, I think you could get it to be as airtight as you would want. But I think you would still have a little bit of problems with leakage, but it's not gonna kill you, hopefully.
Yeah, hopefully. That's the key. I do think that Atlantis had a problem with one of the thermal blankets, and an EVA to do some sewing was considered, but I think, how did they end up
I think
fixing
they
that?
ended up fixing it with staples. They
Staples.
pushed all the thermal blanket because these are the really thick silica thermal blankets that they have on the outside of the space shuttle, and it was on one of the pods, I think the OMS pods, and they had to push all of the blanket back in because I don't know. I guess during launch it loosened itself, but they went back and they stapled it. I think with the medical staples that they had.
So there was a lot of things I didn't think of when we first started looking at sewing in space. I didn't think about, well, sewing is about attaching two pieces of fabric to another in structural way, right? So like it holds. But then there's also, when you think about parachutes and when they rip, there's certain pieces where the stitching is designed to
Separate.
to separate and allow some like on a climbing vest, our climbing harness, when you fall, the stitching gives you some stress relief. It slows you down a little bit. And so this sewing becomes really important and very accurate. And it's actually a really big part of the space industry. Think about all the things that are sewed. So we've talked about, heat shields, right? Parachutes,
Thermal blankets,
space suits. Then don't forget all of the stuff for humanity. You got bags, and you got sleeping bags, and you got what's the
padding,
cooling suit that they
the
wear
under
the undergarments?
the cooling undergarment. I don't know the actual name of it. It's got a very interesting title.
And we saw that really cool video. So working on computers, I really appreciated this. In the Saturn V, I believe the RAM was actually a bunch of magnets sewn onto a metal fabric, and that's how they actually controlled the RAM inside of the computer in the early Saturn V. Sewing has been so instrumental, and I just wanted to take the time to let everybody know how important this skill is, because when you think of, and I know Jack and I kind of focus a lot on engineering, but there's a lot of jobs that go into making space flight possible. You've got people who climb towers, you got people who draw logos, right, to help explain the mission patches. You've got people who help the space suits get delivered to the right place and help the astronauts get in them. There's so many jobs. What job are you interested in, Jack?
Building the thing that the people are getting into, the astronauts.
So you want to climb on them?
No, I would like to design, build, and, well, maybe not build directly, but design and engineer the spacecraft.
Okay. Well, that's definitely an important part of it. Everybody has a place, though, in the space industry and in the future of space flight. What we have to do is focus on creating, the skill set in the youth of today. So one of the reasons why we started Jack and Chad's rocket van was we wanted to talk about how companies like SpaceX are inspiring the future astronauts and engineers and even seamstresses out there on creating the next version of space flight. I think that they've done a really good job, and we can be able to discuss that. Jack has been really inspired. And why don't you tell him about what you think about the rockets that you saw in this last trip?
So we went to Florida to go see Falcon Heavy and two Falcon 9s. And then directly before, we went to Boca Chica, Texas to go see Starship. And, I just think it's amazing to see what people are doing, and I think it's going to inspire people to want to do that as well, just because I think it's amazing.
That's really cool. The big part I want to cover before we close out this video is I want to show you some of the cool stuff that people have sewn. I didn't realize that people on the space stations and the shuttles have possibly sewn. So what I'm going to do is give you a couple examples of what I think is really cool that people have sewn in space. And I'm going to try to find a couple examples to show you how clearly sewing has been important in the space. And
if you've ever wondered why you saw this dinosaur floating around the beginning of the video, here's why. In 2013, NASA astronaut Karen Nyberg brought up some needle and thread with her and took some recycled materials from around the ISS, such as a t-shirt and old food packaging liners, the bags that the food comes in, and she made this little dinosaur, which is super cute, and it floated around the ISS for a little while.
NASA astronaut Chris Cassidy credits his time as a Navy SEAL, where he learned how to sew heavy objects together. He took that time to repair some gloves on the ISS as seen here, but he also took some time to upgrade the kitchen on board. Sewing skills can come in handy both on Earth and in space. These were just two examples of how things have been sewn in space. First we saw a dinosaur, and then we saw somebody actually sewing things to repair a glove and work on a space station. And it's funny, one of Rocket Van's early subscribers, Mike, has sent us an email today about an opening at SpaceX for a spacesuit sewer in Hawthorne, California. Isn't that kind of a coincidence there, Jack?
It sure is. Seeing somebody who also pays attention to, how many people are sewing in space.
Yeah, it's really good. We're going to keep adding videos to a little playlist talking about different things that we find that have been sewn in space. The salary on that position is listed between $70,000 and $90,000. That's a great starting salary for anybody who's looking to get into the space industry. So please leave us any comments. Jack, we're wrapping up our first video. You have anything for the audience?
Make sure if you like videos like this, make sure to like them. Make sure to comment that you want to see more videos like this because it really helps us know what we're trying to do with our audience.
And of course, share. Make sure you share our videos. That helps us get it out. So for Rocket Van, this is Chad.
And I'm Jack.
Roger.
Over and out.